It's interesting to kind of take that brief video in. The wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in 1955 after an absence of more than 70 years. And of course, as we saw, the environmental impact of that has been enormously successful, in fact, stunningly so. The video not only captured the awe and beauty of the Western landscape, but it also gave, I think, compelling evidence that despite all of the rhetoric about the interconnected web of all existence, I don't think we are all fully 100% conscious of what that actually means, all the implications of our connections. The video cleverly demonstrated that when nature is shamefully controlled by the will of human beings, it is usually met with disastrous results. The landscape of the West means so much to us here, personally, doesn't it? And it's probably a pretty big factor of why we find ourselves situated here in the environment today. So on this, our church's birthday, I want to place its origins not only into an historical context, but also appreciate the landscape as offering to us a source of wildness, as well as raising environmental concerns with which we have wrestled throughout most of our 123 years of being here in Salt Lake Valley. Now, with the exception of those who are relatively new to this church, probably most of us know the story of how this church began on this weekend, 1891. Samuel Atkins Elliott, for whom our social hall, Elliott Hall, is named, preached a fiery brand of Unitarianism from his pulpit at the First Unitarian Church in Denver, Colorado. Some liberals in Salt Lake City, who knew Elliott from back in their time together at Harvard, in fact, performing together in the Harvard Glee Club, prevailed upon Elliott to travel to Salt Lake City in order to plant the Unitarian seeds in this unlikely environment. Although not Elliott's first choice of things to do, it's hard to let down people you sing with or have sung with in the past. Music generates a kind of loyalty to which our own choir members can certainly attest. So Elliott spoke in Salt Lake twice, in December 1890. And by February 24th, 1891, 127 good liberals agreed to become charter members of the First Unitarian Church. We owe them an enormous debt of gratitude. And Elliott was probably best suited for proselytizing the liberal gospel because by 1900 he was elevated to the presidency of the whole American Unitarian Association. Our church immediately began rocking the boat in this culture, calling David Utter as its minister. He was the first clergyman or scholar to bring the relatively new field of biblical criticism to the table. Not a very popular subject among the locals here at that time. It surely cast the first shadow of notoriety upon this church. First Unitarian Church began in 1891, the same year that the angel Moroni, sculpted by the Unitarian Cyrus Dallin, was hoisted upon the temple spire. Two celebrated creations, an angel and a Unitarian congregation, introduced to Salt Lake City at virtually the same time. The angel Moroni looked steadfastly east, immutable in its posture, while it is said that the weather vane atop the Unitarian steeple moves in whatever direction the wind happens to blow. Now, I think the year of our origin, 1891, remains mostly meaningless, or it just kind of escapes what this is really all about, 1891, unless we root it in the history of that time. So we begin to see that 1891 is not just this arbitrary number, but what was going on in this country, in the West, in 1891. Our forebears here were, after all, pioneers in a new Western landscape. Just 5 years before the birth of our church, the Apache war chief Geronimo had surrendered, and in the year this church actually was launched, the Sioux Indians were defeated at the Battle of Wounded Knee. Give you some kind of idea of the time. By 1900, the Indians were on reservations, and the buffalo were gone. The world's first oil well had been drilled as early as 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. But by the time our church was organized, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust dominated the world's petroleum markets and controlled more than 90% of our nation's refinery capacity. Now, just a few years prior to putting down roots in Salt Lake City, Andrew Carnegie constructed the world's largest steel mill in Pittsburgh. And by 1900, the United States was the largest steel producer in the world. Our church was founded 1 year before Henry Ford built his first gasoline engine car. And by 1903, the Ford Motor Company was underway, and so too, of course, the entire auto industry. This home for religious liberals sprang into being about a dozen years before Marconi gave us the radio. The Wright brothers were hard at work on their flying machine, and Louis Sullivan emerged as the father of the American skyscraper. This was the Old West, long before its urbanization. It held, I think, a singular beauty, a pristine landscape, the stuff of bold imaginations, which heralded vast and wild open spaces, and where nature ran its course unimpeded by human influence. In 1891, the same year that this church was founded, Congress enacted the Forest Reserve Act, empowering presidents of the United States to set aside parcels of public land as national forest reserves. How this magnificent Western landscape was to be used and to what end stirred as much controversy 123 years ago as it does today. Now imagine what the West must have represented for an aging Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1870. This great Unitarian from Concord, Massachusetts, who, by the way, whose father was a Unitarian minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson entered the ministry but resigned after only 4 years. He famously said it was the better part of a man that urged him to leave the ministry. Emerson then, after the ministry, of course, became this giant figure in the whole Transcendentalist movement. He was an extraordinary lecturer and essayist, including his profound essay entitled Nature.